And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Keelan Balderson here. Welcome back to the show on this December 5th. Sorry for not being here last week. I was a bit too croaky to make any sense, really. Got a bit of cookies illness, I think. I've still got a bit of a cough, so bear with me if I start spluttering everywhere. But I got to admit, I've only really got myself to blame. I'm usually a vitamin junkie. I now do fruit and veggie smoothies every day, really getting into the health food stuff, and I very rarely get ill anymore. I mean, if you're providing the body everything it needs, if you're getting a good night's sleep and regular exercise, you're not going to get ill. And if you do, because, I don't know, somebody sneezed in your mouth or something, you're going to fight it off quite easy. And that's usually the way it goes for me, but being the young party animal that I am, I decided to go on a 2-day binge drinking session with a bunch of people that were already sick. The girl I was with was sick, so just this big sick fest. And my usual fruit smoothies and vitamins became McDonald's and pizza. So do the math. I mean, if anybody deserves to get ill, it's somebody eating McDonald's. And I also, of course, spent a few days in the infested student accommodation in Manchester. So if you've ever been around students, you're going to get sick. So I hope you can all forgive me for that. But we're back on track. The website, as always, is wideshut.co.uk for all of my articles and videos. And for the network, it's resistradio.com. Coming up in the second half of the show, I'm going to be talking to Chris Morris. I'll just post his web link in. He's the author of Hostile Takeover, the Anglo-American Establishment and the Emerging Global Corporate State. So be sure to tweet and Facebook and carrier pigeon about the show and let everyone know we're live, because it's going to be a good show tonight. But first, I want to get into some news about climate change. On my last live show, I was talking about how the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have basically begun to backtrack on some of their alarmism, basically admitting that they don't know whether man-made CO2 has any bearing on extreme weather events. Things like, abnormally cold winters, hurricanes, the whole gambit. And they rewrote their definition of climate change to finally include natural forces and cycles that the planet has been going through for millions of years, long before we were ever on it, driving around on our 4x4s. And they even went as far as to say that they don't know whether the actual instances of extreme weather have even increased anyway. Since this supposed man-made warming period, they can't even be certain that there have been more hurricanes or whatever. So that's how much they really know about this stuff. So that was one thing that I talked about last week. Then it came out that the BBC's top environment reporter had actually been receiving funding from the university at the heart of ClimateGate 1. And, those leaked emails where they talked about hiding the decline, that they couldn't account for the lack of warming in the last 10 years. They were trying to prevent skeptics' research from passing the peer review process. Well, not long after last time's show, as you're now all probably aware, ClimateGate 2.0 took place. Another ClimateGate. A second round of emails have been leaked, once again showing that the scientists who keep telling us that man is destroying the planet might actually be distorting the truth a little bit. Now, one of the fundamental principles of science is open and honest debate. I'm sure we can all agree on that. The peer review process, which they like to harp on about a lot. the sharing of data, the confirming and reconfirming of results. Well, instead of that, we have this closed-off clique called the IPCC, who have basically appointed themselves as the all-seeing, all-knowing experts that we have to agree with. And they've peddled this idea that because their small group are saying one thing, then it's a consensus. But I think we should emphasize the con in consensus. But let's get to ClimateGate 2. I've got some of the emails here. Here's one from our old friend, Professor Phil Jones, who, of course, after a lengthy government investigation, was found to be innocent after ClimateGate 1. Well, this is what he has to say in ClimateGate 2. I've been told that the IPCC is above National Freedom of Information Acts. One way to cover yourself and all those working on AR5, because, of course, if you're being truthful, you have to cover yourself and hide your work. One way to cover yourself and all of those working on AR5 would be to delete all emails and at the end of the process. Any work we have done in the past is done on the back of the research grants we get and has to be well hidden. I've discussed this with the main funder, the US Department of Energy, in the past, and they are happy about not releasing the original station data. So, they're above the law. They're above public scrutiny because we can't gather any information from Freedom of Information requests. And despite the fact they make all these claims in their reports that deeply affect our way of life, they and their research is essentially untouchable. The original data will not be released to the masses. I mean, if they've got nothing to hide, they're certainly going the wrong way about it. Maybe they need a better PR firm or something. Another email shows that the scientists may be manipulating the data. The basic problem is that all the models are wrong. Well, at least they admit it in private. We've not got enough middle and low-level clouds. What Zwiers has done comes to a different conclusion than Casper and Jean. Casper and Jean, eh? I reckon this can be saved by careful wording. So they do this half-assed analysis that doesn't match up to other scientists in the IPCC, and they plan to fix it all with careful wording because they can't admit that they're wrong, or they can't debate about it. Now, I mentioned the extreme weather stuff the other week that they've actually backtracked on, but the emails show that at one point they were doing their best to try and make a link between man-made climate change and an increase in hurricane activity. And in one email, a scientist called Kevin Trenberth basically wanted to ignore the data from the northern hemisphere and just focus on Japan. Now, obviously, for data to be accurate, they have to take into account as many parts of the world as possible. It's supposed to be global warming, right? If it's really hot in one area, it may be really cold in another. You have to factor in all these different things. Well, in this case, they decided just to focus on Japan to try and cherry-pick the data that suggests man-made climate change is somehow linked to hurricanes. And here's what one of the emails says. Opposing some things said by people like Chris Lancy, who has said all the stuff going on is a natural variability, in addition to the 4 hurricanes hitting Florida, there has been a record number hit Japan. And then they say 10 with a question mark. And he carries on. I saw a report saying Japanese scientists had linked this to global warming. I am leaning toward the idea of getting a box of changes in hurricanes, perhaps written by a Japanese. I don't know what he means by a Japanese, but I guess he means a Japanese scientist. But it says here, a Japanese. Phil Jones agreed, writing, we can put a note in that something will be there in the next draft, or Kevin or I will write something. It depends on whether and what we get from Japan. So, They were desperately trying to find data to fit this preconceived framework that they've got going on. Trying to find one guy in Japan that has made this link so they could cite him in their reports. Here's another email from Phil Jones. Kevin, seems that this potential Nature Journal paper may be worth citing, if it does say that global warming is having an effect on tropical cyclone activity. Getting people we know and trust into the IPCC is vital, hence my comment about the Tornadoes group. So, you can just picture it. They're scouring all the literature, trying to find something that they can cite, and they found this Nature Journal somewhere, and then he says, we can only have people we trust in the IPCC. You got to start asking yourselves, is this science or is this politics? I think it's politics. It's an ideology. It's an idea that they're working with, and they're just trying to fit it to their preconceived notion, I think. The IPCC's Jonathan Overpeck, he wrote, "The trick may be to decide on the main message and use that to guide what's included and what's left out." Well, I think he overpecked the line there, don't you think? That's a cardinal sin of science. How is that any different than a dogmatic religious person who thinks the world's only 6,000 years old? They refuse to take on any other information, such as dinosaurs or whatever you want to run with there. And it's the same with climate change. It's become a new religion, a new dogma. They have their story and they're sticking to it. And they cherry pick to fit their conclusions, to ensure they keep getting their grants, to ensure their egos aren't bruised. And so the ideologues can continue with their global governance plans. And the religion thing, it's not just an analogy. I covered this last year in an article for WideShut, but there's a professor, Professor Shearman, who was an assessor for the IPCC's third and fourth reports, and he wrote in his book, Green or Gone, this is what he wrote. "It is not impossible that from the Green movement and aspects of the New Age movement, a religious alternative to Christianity and Islam will emerge. And it's not too difficult to imagine what shape this new religion could take. One would require a transcendent God who could punish and reward because humans seem to need a carrot on a stick." They're mocking you, philosophizing about the lower humans and how we could give them a new religion. But Mother Gaia can't be 100% dictator like we want her to be. We've got to give them a carrot on the stick, else no one will be productive enough while they're slaving away. And I guess if they're going to give us a carrot, it'll probably be a Monsanto GMO carrot. These guys are insane. It's insanity. And this is what else Professor Shearman of the IPCC writes in his book. "Government in the future will be based upon a supreme office of the biosphere. The office will comprise of specially trained philosopher/ecologists. These guardians will either rule themselves or advise an authoritarian government of policies based on their ecological training and philosophical sensitivities. These guardians will be specially trained for the task." This guy, you can see it. He's imagining some Mount Olympus somewhere where the guardians can dictate to us all. How more creepy can you get? Just read some of these people's books and articles. The only way you can describe it is creepy. It's just weird, It's some strange cult or something. And I don't know how many of you watch Question Time. Whenever I watch it, I end up throwing the remote at the TV or lobbing the computer out the shed or whatever. But Chris Huhne, who is our Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, You see, they have to add climate change on because now it's like a whole new department. He was on Question Time last week. I guess they must have taped it before all this came out. If they didn't, then they're clearly like covering up, because this should have been an important thing to ask the guy about, ClimateGate 2.0. But he reiterated that Britain is going to lead the way for green energy and CO2 cuts going forward. But personally, I'd like him to address the elderly in this country, because it was only last year that the Met Office refused to say that it was going to be a cold winter. Despite alternative weather monitors like Piers Corbyn is a good one to follow, he came out and said, look, it's going to be a record cold winter. Everybody needs to be prepared for this. And the Met Office is there saying, oh, la-di-da, it's going to be, just a normal winter. But because of that whether it was just a complete refusal to tell us the truth, or they're deluded by their own climate change alarmism or whatever, for whatever reason, the Met Office told us that it wasn't going to be an extremely cold winter, and therefore old people died, quite frankly, because they weren't prepared. The economy got screwed because they couldn't prepare for the postal delays and all this kind of thing. The country suffered because the Met Office are too blinded by this climate change stuff. They're deluded. And they still came out and said the cold, well, in the end, yeah, they still came out and said that the cold was down to climate change anyway. They cover all their bases. Everything is man-made climate change. The sun coming up in the morning is man-made climate change. But I'm losing my point. Excuse me. If Britain is to lead the way for green energy, like Chris Huhne says so, then what they're not telling you, unfortunately, is that also means Britain is going to lead the way to poverty. Because as much as old people can't afford their heating bills now, as the energy companies are slowly moving over to the green energy, the government are forcing us to pick up the tab. And this is an extract of an article that I wrote some months back. As part of the Energy Secretary's plans to cut carbon emissions in a futile and illogical attempt to counter climate change, energy companies are being encouraged to ditch traditional energy and invest in expensive nuclear power stations and wind farms. Of course, these billion-pound investments won't harm the energy companies themselves. Instead, the costs will be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher bills, right at the time when Britain faces record unemployment in recent years. The Telegraph notes, funding that investment will cost households more than $500 a year on top of the current total energy bill of $1,157. It's just the next Ponzi scheme, the next fascist policy in a long line of fascist policies, all on the road to global governance. We're always told that we've got a free market and we need to spread the free market into the Middle East and into Libya and whatever. But what's free about a government policy that allows the big energy companies to go green at our expense? That's not a free market. There's no alternative for us to choose from, unless you want to completely get off the grid and run to the woods or something. But we can't vote with our pounds. We don't have any pounds left to vote with. And the little that we do have is slowly but surely becoming more and more worthless thanks to the banksters. So, the future looks quite grim. The energy sector really is a cartel that's backed by the government. And the green agenda is just another phase, another method of reaching global governance. It's a way of laying down the bureaucratic framework for global governance. It gets people linked together global taxes and all that kind of thing. And we've got to be prepared for that. It's all about global governance, global control of resources. As Professor Sherman says in his book, a supreme office of the biosphere, a global authoritarian state run by guardians on Mount Olympus. Now, it's not that I don't care about the Earth's resources. Of course I do. That's why I don't want it to be handed over to a bunch of corporate fascists. You see, they've developed this culture of self-loathing greenies where everything's man's fault. Humanity is evil. Humanity is a cancer. There's too many of us. We're destroying the planet, and everybody feels guilty about it. Listen to the guardians on Mount Olympus, folks. I've got some quotes here from the Club of Rome. They state in one of their earlier reports, way back in, I think, the 70s, the Earth has cancer, and cancer is man. Nice to know they care about us so much. Personally, I would say the cancer is the anti-human control freaks that run the world, but that's just my opinion. You are the enemy in these people's eyes. They hate your freedom. Yeah, this group of people actually do hate our freedoms. They want global control. And if you go along with the green agenda, even if you're well-meaning, that's exactly what you're going to give them, global control. And I've said this before, but even if global warming was exactly as they say it is, and it's a big problem, it's just a bonus for the elite, because their solution is not the answer to the problem. The Club of Rome writes in this same report, I should have got the name of it, I can't remember it off my head. A common enemy must be found, I think it's the global revolution or something like that. It's on Wikipedia and whatever. A common enemy must be found, one either real or invented, to unite humanity. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. So, whether there is a problem or not, the globalists are going to exploit it regardless, because they want to unite humanity. And they don't want to unite us because they're all loving. They want to unite us because they want global control. Now, remember Mikhail Gorbachev, the New World Order quote of the week, which I read out a few weeks ago. He's a member of the Club of Rome think tank. And I'll just go over his quote again. He was talking about how the Occupy movement needs to seek a new world order. This is what he said. Others, including myself, have spoken about a new world order, but we are still facing the problem of building such a world order. Problems of environment, of backwardness and poverty, food shortages, all because we do not have a system of global governance. As we are addressing these challenges, these problems raised by these protest movements, we will gradually find our way towards a new world order. These are the kind of people we're dealing with, whether it's on the fascist side or the communist side. They're all still globalists. They all still want global control. And forgive me for not wanting to give that to them. I prefer individual freedom, not global dictatorship. I mean, is that so hard to understand? But anyway, we're coming up to the half an hour. I'm going to play a quick song, and then we're going to come back with our guest, Chris Morris. So catch you back in 2 minutes. Okay, welcome back to the WideShut webcast. Jumping over to our guest, Chris Morris. He is the author of Hostile Takeover, the Anglo-American Establishment and the Emerging Global Corporate State. And he also wrote the article George Monbiot, Nuclear Power and the New World Order, for the WideShut website. And if I press this button here, we should be able to hear him. Hello, Chris. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, Keelan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Thanks for taking the time out to be with me tonight.
No problem at all. My pleasure.
Now, I know you have some similar views about the green agenda that I've been covering today.
Yeah, you were just talking about a load of stuff I was going to talk about, but don't worry about that.
Well, one issue that you've raised that I haven't talked about is the smart meters thing.
Yeah.
Why don't you go into that? Because some people might not know what a smart meter is, and what are the implications of using smart meters. Why don't you just break that down for us?
Right, well, smart meters are, as the name would suggest, a type of electricity meter that are now being heavily promoted to replace the existing metering technology that exists. And in accordance with this is the smart grid technology, as they refer to it, which is essentially just a new electricity network. And it sounds, they try to make it sound very fluffy, as they do with this sort of thing. And if you actually read the document, there is a European Commission document that I read. I had to read the entire document in order to write the book, because I wanted to get to the bottom of what it was all about. And I can assure you it's firstly an incredibly obtuse document, and secondly it's incredibly boring. It goes on for about 30 pages.
Right.
I read the whole thing and went through it all and tried to get to the bottom of what it was really about. And as I was reading it, I thought, I was starting to understand what it's about. It's all in this very legalistic language. And I started to think, oh, this sounds like the internet. And then 2 pages after I thought that, they started comparing it to the internet. Now, of course, what you have with the internet is it's bidirectional. That's the term they use in this documentation, bidirectional. So you're sitting here using the internet now thinking, I can just use the internet wherever I want to. But of course, your internet service provider can throttle your connection whenever they want to. And
right,
most sort of mainstream ISPs do that. And the more you read it, the more you and look into it, the more you realise that they're going to have the potential and the capability, once this smart grid technology is in place, to almost ration or actually ration the usage of electricity. And the chief executive of the National Grid, I can't recall his name, but he was given an interview for the BBC, and he said by 2020 this will happen, and you will consume, his words were something like, you will consume electricity when it is cheap and when it is available. And the Daily Telegraph picked up on this, and if you...
So this is happening in Britain as well as America?
Oh, yeah, it's happening now, yeah. I mean, the European Commission, the European Union legislation is all in place. I mean, it's all been passed. In America, there was a bill that's been covered quite a lot by the alternative media that Obama was pushing, which is exactly the same technology, exactly the same agenda. And I don't think it passed. I think it got blocked by the Senate or the Congress. But, that doesn't mean it's going away. They're not just going to say, oh, right, well, you've blocked that, so we'll give up now. They just come back a year later or whenever they think it's, it'll be easier to pass it. And if you look up any electricity company, I've put some quotations in from General Electric and put a picture in from the company on their website promoting smart grid technology. But if you look on numerous electricity companies' websites, they will be promoting this technology, because it all ties into climate change as well, because you have the sort of green agenda of there's the 80% figure that was agreed at Kyoto Protocol, which is reducing the amount of carbon dioxide produced by 80%. So this is all the smart grid technology is being brought in concordance with this. So
what's the official kind of what's the official reasoning for us having this? Is it basically climate change to monitor how much everyone's using? Or
they don't say that explicitly, although there's this constant green emphasis that you see in the documentation. So they don't say, oh, we're bringing in smart grid technology because climate change is really dangerous. It's a bit more nuanced than that. But they're clearly trying to play on those fears when introducing it. But if you actually read the document, which I wouldn't recommend too highly, but if you had to skim through it, you'd see that they just try and make it sound like it's great. They try and they're sort of saying, all of the existing electricity network's out of date, so we need to upgrade it. And this new network is going to be so much more flexible. It's brilliant. And of course, the reason it needs to, on one level, it needs to be more flexible because they're phasing out all the old fossil fuel, carbon dioxide producing forms of electricity and moving into all this green technology. So what the electricity companies want to do is essentially sell you less product for more money and more profit for them. And as they change to all these green forms of quote unquote green forms of electricity, they actually get the cost of that subsidised by the consumer. And in addition to that, you or I will eventually, I believe, they will try and push some carbon credit system for human beings. I haven't sort of heard that pushed explicitly yet, although there's cap and trade and stuff like that, which you may have heard of. I'm sure you have. But all the energy companies have got carbon offsets, and they're already all engaging in carbon trading, and there's investment banks and all this sort of powerful infrastructure. They're all trading carbon.
Al Gore already a carbon billionaire, so.
Yeah, and he owns a significant share in a company called Silver Spring Networks, which is the company that's promoting and installing smart grid technology in the United States. So he goes on TV and people say to him, "So Al Gore, what do you think should happen?" "Oh, we need a lot more green energy." "What are you invested in?" Coincidentally, I'm invested in green energy. But, for you or I, that would be called insider trading. For him, it's called being concerned about the environment, and you get Nobel if you've got the right connections, you get Nobel Peace Prizes for that sort of thing. Whereas if you or I attempted that, we'd be arrested. And
exactly.
That's really what happens. Sorry,
people can read more about those reports and stuff within your book. Which where's the best place for people to actually buy it? Is it on Amazon or at your web link?
Well, there's three ways really. I made a Kindle version, so if you've got a Kindle, it's on Amazon. I've done a blog where you can buy the PDF version of the book, or it also points to some other retailers where you can buy it, and that's Hostile Takeover Book, or one word, .blogspot.com. And it's also hopefully, well, I'm pretty sure it's going to be published in the next couple of months, because I've got some interest from a publisher and they said they're definitely interested in doing it. It's been penciled in for January. I don't feel 100% certain it's going to happen until it actually does, because, I don't know, I'm just a bit pessimistic, but I've got it in writing that it definitely is going to happen, and they definitely seem interested. So that will be a third option if and when it happens, but maybe I can come on again and discuss some further issues at that time.
Absolutely. Well, I'd certainly recommend people do get a copy, and if they're looking for a more contemporary analysis of the New World Order agenda, because I think a lot of the older books, the kind of classics in the conspiracy movement or whatever, they were kind of around at a time when the information was still being pieced together. But today, it's very much an open conspiracy, and I think you've done a great job of sourcing everything and bringing everything together without kind of falling into that conspiracy theory kind of narrative. So I definitely recommend it to everyone who's listening. But I guess a basic question to ask, considering the book is about the Anglo-American establishment, what is the Anglo-American establishment? And this ever-apparent corporate power structure that some of us may call the New World Order, or just break down your overview of what this actually is. Right, well, you could, of course, call it the Anglo-American Israeli establishment, but I felt it was a long enough title for the book as it was. And the Anglo-American establishment was a book by Carol Quigley as well, so it seemed an appropriate title. But when you describe it as a corporate structure, I think corporate is the key word, because even people that are relatively awake and relatively aware that there is corruption in the world, they tend to look at the state or the government, however you want to express that entity, and they tend to look at that as being where the real power is, whereas the real power lies behind the government. And there's been many, many clues to this down the years, and one of the most obvious clues for me was in Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, in which he referred to the military-industrial complex. Most people have heard of this now, or
when I say most people, I don't know what percentage of the public would have heard of it, but it's not a remote concept. It's a pretty well-known concept. So I sort of describe the structure that holds the major power in the world as the banking, military, industrial, governmental complex. I think the banks have to be included in that structure because they're central to the whole operation. They invest in the arms manufacturers, they invest in the corporations, they lend money to the same people, they bankroll the wars the government authorise, and also the international banking structure and the financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF are used to funnel money when this structure is taking over the resources and infrastructure of developing or third world countries. If you read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, he describes this process.
Great book.
It's a very good book, yeah. It's fascinating in a way when you look at it, how different the world actually is to how it's presented to us. And if you read a book like that and someone is an insider, then you begin to understand that things are very different. The military element is sort of represented by arms contractors. Obviously, they provide the weaponry that is utilised in these wars, so they're important in that respect. But the military's become contractors, and the military complex has become particularly important for one unique reason. Arms contractors are not the biggest corporations in the world. In fact, I think there's a couple in the top 500 corporations in the world according to Forbes, but they're not up there with, JP Morgan, ExxonMobil, those type of corporations. But what is unique about arms contractors is their only customers are governments. So you're not going to get someone knocking on your door saying, "Would you like to buy a cruise missile?" Right. Whereas if you take someone like Walmart, they look like it. I think they have 35% of the grocery market in the US. They're massively powerful, and you look at them and you tend to think they're completely unchallengeable. But of course, they're completely reliant on the public. If the public stop going to Walmart, they're finished. And they have to pay attention to consumer choice. Now, of course, arms contractors engage in PR like any other corporation, but they're the only people they care about are the government. All they need is people to work for them and governments to buy weapons off them. So they forge very strong contacts within government, and you tend to see this particularly happens in the UK, it also happens in the US, but particularly in Britain, there's a revolving door between arms contractors and the British government. And I wrote about this at some length. And the other thing is arms contractors get given government contracts like there are never going to be any more government contracts ever given out. You could list numerous. The most obvious one is Lockheed Martin being given the census contract, but it's by no means the only one. There's a company called Thales that were given the e-borders contract, paid billions of pounds to do it. There's no end of contracts being given to arms manufacturers. So to move on to the third element is the industrial element, and they're the multinational corporations who also invest in the arms industry. They benefit from the acquisition of the resources via either wars or the type of activity that's discussed in the book by John Perkins. And then governments really have the dual role of creating the legislative conditions in which this structure can prosper, and also powerful governments tend to have, particularly the British and American governments, which have been very imperialistic, they tend to have foreign policy aims that can be met by warfare, so they're constantly feeding this structure. And then lastly, and this is sort of symbolically represented by the fact that it's hyphenated, military-industrial complex is hyphenated because those two things are interdependent, and banking, military, industrial, governmental complex, I've hyphenated it to kind of symbolise this interdependence. So you have banks investing in the arms industry, banks lending money to corporations, corporations invest in the arms industry, corporations require resources to be profitable, so they require the arms industry to flourish. Banks obviously want to make money, so they wish for the corporations and arms contractors to remain profitable as they're investing in them, and for governments to keep going to war so they can lend them more money to do so, and so on. So there are clear vested interests for each of these elements to continually put pressure on governments to have an aggressive interventionist foreign policies because they all benefit. So, sorry, go on.
I think you make a good point that it's a combination of everything. It's a fascist merger between all these different elements. So a lot of people like to point the blame solely at the government. A lot of people like to point the blame solely at the corporations, but it really is that they use each other. The ideologues use the systems that are in place together, like you say, rather than just, oh, it's the government, oh, it's the evil corporations.
Yeah, I think partly the structure has emerged due to a plan. I mean, if you look at, to mention Quigley again, Quigley's book Tragedy and Hope, he traces it back much further than I have. I took a sort of post-Second World War focus just purely because it's a pretty big book anyway, and you've got to draw the line somewhere, so I just thought I'd look at the post-Second World War world. But Mussolini said fascism should more appropriately be called corporatism because it's a merger of state and corporate power. And so that's what you really see. You see this merger of state and corporate power. I mean, I would argue that it's not so much a merger, it's more that the state facilitates the corporate power. And as a result of this, the sort of desires and aims of corporations become indivisible from public policy. It was uncanny today. I just happened to be walking past a pizza shop, and there was David Cameron was on TV, and I just looked to see what he was talking about, and what was he doing? And I've got an article here. Britain has earmarked £180 million to bring new medical technologies to market in a move that should speed the take-up of new medicines by the National Health Service and make the country more attractive to big pharma firms. Well, that's just what we need, isn't it? You know, I mean, I was really concerned that the big pharma firms didn't have enough penetration in the UK already. So
we've got a market to get more of them in here.
Yeah, he's earmarked £180 million of public money to give the. But this is what you see: government policy. It doesn't. People there, even people that are relatively critical of the government, will tend to sit there and think, well, he must be making this decision for the best interest of the country. But of course, that's not the case at all. I mean, if you look at government policy time and time again, it's just to facilitate this corporate structure that actually lies behind the government and which is where the real power lies. And of course, right at the top of the hierarchy is the banking system and the international banks, particularly the likes of the International Monetary Fund, and then it all feeds into the Bank of International Settlements, which is described as the central bank of central banks. And you know, we've seen all these things going on in Greece at the moment, and Italy and Spain and Portugal, and because it's never happened in Europe, or it hasn't happened in Europe in living memory, we tend to view it as, oh, these are incredible circumstances. This is an amazing thing that's happening here. This is unheralded. But all we're seeing now is what's been happening in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East for generations. There's a document. I haven't got any notes about me from this. I'm saying it off the top of my head, but I think the guy involved was called George F. Kennan, Kennan, and it was published in 1949. It's some sort of internal government report in the United States, and he said that Africa is going to be set up as a source of natural resources for the Western world, and that the Western world, people in the Western world, would get a lift from this process of exploiting Africa. And if you look around you today, and you look at the way people live, and you look at what's happened to Africa, you could say that what he predicted would happen is entirely mirrored in what does occur. So what we're seeing now in Italy, we've seen over the last couple of days where they're talking about Merkel's been standing up and saying that, oh, we need to give up our sovereignty and we need the European Union to. I think they're proposing that every European Union can have its own nation can have its own individual budget, but that it has to be signed off, much like you'd have a line manager at work that would sign off your work.
Yeah. The headline today is Franco-German budget plan demands EU treaty change, and they're basically saying that, you know, we need a new framework where we're all beholden to them.
and of course, what you have to realise is it's not going to help at all. You know, even in the Guardian, there's an article in the Guardian here, and it says the last paragraph is the proposal does not resolve Europe's underlying economic malaise, which is why those talking of a game-changing moment are matched by those who say it's just another temporary respite. And that's exactly what it is, because all of these solutions to these economic problems, although they try and make them sound incredibly complex, just involve creating more debt. Now, if you just think about it on a basic level of household finances, if you've got debt and you create more debt, then have you resolved the situation? No, you haven't resolved the situation. You've just postponed the issue for a while longer. If you go to a payday loan company, or if you go to a loan shark, have you solved your financial problems? No, you haven't. You've made yourself deeper financial problems. And all that's really going to happen is, sooner or later, when the proverbial hits the fan, it's going to hit the fan a lot harder. And that's all that's happening now. It's all that's happening in the United States, where they just raised the debt ceiling to $16.3 trillion. And I saw Obama come on TV and go, yeah, we've definitely sorted it out now. There's not going to be any further problems in relation to that. And already they're over $15 trillion in debt. They were 14.3 at the time they raised the debt ceiling. And the US budget deficit is $1.3 trillion. Just to explain that briefly, that means, in simple terms, they're spending $1.3 trillion more than they're earning. So just simple arithmetic will tell you the $15 trillion in debt, the debt ceiling is $16.3 trillion. About a year from now, they're going to be sitting around going, oh, what are we going to do again? Let's raise the debt ceiling again. And they're just really postponing the inevitable. And the inevitable is that, there's only two possible things that could happen. Well, there's three. There's three things that possibly happen. There could be a total systemic collapse. The currencies of the UK and the US could be largely devalued. Or the most honourable thing to do would be to default on the debt, in which case you'd have a few years of an absolutely gut-wrenching depression, but you'd have a chance of coming out of it eventually. But this is inevitable. I saw Max Kaiser being interviewed, and he said, he used the expression that it's baked into the cake. So I won't pass that off as my own expression, but I thought it was a particularly good way of putting it.
Well, I was going to ask, what do you think the end goal of the EU is? Are they desperately clinging to the dream of the EU, or do they actually want it to fail so they can bring something else in after that? What's your take on that?
Well, I think there are people within the European Union. I mean, I think if I were a bureaucrat in the European Union and I was on a six-figure salary plus whatever expenses I wanted, and I had my nose well and truly in the trough, I'd want the EU to continue as long as possible. So I think there are people that do want it to continue, and I think there are probably those within the EU sort of hierarchy that realise that it's doomed to collapse. If you saw there was footage of Nigel Farage recently speaking in the European Parliament, and I was watching the people he was speaking to, and he was slagging them off and so forth, and it was really notable to me that the people he was addressing, who were the other European politicians, bureaucrats, whatever you want to call them, they sort of had the body language of a child that's being told off by his mother that knew that it had done the wrong thing, that set fire to something, and they knew they shouldn't have done it, and they knew they were wrong, and they knew that what the mum was saying was right. That was very much the body language they had, and I think I think they know the euro's not going to last, and I think they know that it's going to have to be replaced by something. Just like, I've heard people talking about the dollar being the world's reserve currency, and that will inevitably end as well. And people are pushing for that. China, in particular, is pushing for that, saying that the dollar shouldn't have reserve currency status, and that's just purely because China is now in a very strong economic position. It's going to be the world's power. If the 20th century has been the American century, it's often said the 21st century will be the Chinese century, and I mean there's no doubt about that. All the economic indicators point to that. So,
do you think the hierarchy are they on board with China, or are they hoping that China will go along with them? Or because I've always found it hard to put China in the puzzle, because they obviously hold a lot of the US debt. They're a production powerhouse, but at the same time, the corporations that are often behind a lot of this stuff, they're the ones jumping ship to China. So it's kind of hard to see where do they fit into it.
Well, I can only give my view on the subject. It is complicated when you look at these geopolitical issues, but I've heard people saying, China's opposed to the New World Order because it's opposed to the United States. And I think if you were to put forward that view and to attach yourself to that viewpoint, I think you'd be making a big mistake. Here's something that anyone can do that's listening to this now, and I think you should all do this. Just type in to Google 2009 BRIC Summit, that's BRIC, B-R-I-C, and statement, 2009 BRIC Summit statement. I think that should bring it up. And they released summits, statements before all these conferences, which BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They're sort of a new sort of power block in the world. And if you look at the statements they made, the 2010 statement is actually on the Council on Foreign Relations website, but the statements they make are very much, it's the exact agenda. You will recognise every single element of it. It's all we need to do something about climate change. We need to have global institutions managing the world economy. You will see nothing in those statements there's anything different from what you've been hearing from the Anglo-American establishment. The only difference being they want to be at the centre of it. They want to be leading it. And you mentioned holding the American treasuries. China's the biggest holder in the world of US treasuries. It's the biggest creditor nation in the world. That means it's got the most money, to put it in simplistic terms. It's got a very small amount of government debt. This is the crazy situation we live in. This is how upside down the world is. If you stop someone in the street tomorrow and said, what's the richest country on the planet, you're probably going to get 90% of people saying the United States. United States is on the list of the world's biggest creditors, it's 196 out of 196. It's the biggest debtor nation in the world. It's the biggest debtor nation in history. And where did I get this information? From the CIA. It's on the CIA's own website. So it's not a secret. The US economy is in a very serious position, and that will have a big knock-on effect on Britain. And of course, the European economy is in a very serious situation as well, and that's not a secret either. So when this all comes to a head, which it's very difficult to say when it will, because I think there's a lot of people that want them to put it off as long as possible, because they're essentially bleeding what's left of this system dry while they can. So it's I don't like to make predictions, because you end up with egg on your face if you make predictions. But what you can say for certain is that the current economic system in Britain and the United States is utterly unsustainable, and that our currencies will definitely tank completely.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to have to stop you there. We're going to go to a break, and we're going to come back into overdrive for YouTube. But to the live listeners, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you all next week, and be sure to come back in half an hour for the reality check show. But we're going to go to break and go into overdrive on YouTube. So I'll be back in a minute with Chris. We are back on the WideShut webcast. I'm here with my guest, Chris Morris. And switching gears now over to Britain. We've seen the rise of the coalition government. Obviously, Cameron's big bankrupt society. There's been plans for prisoners to start working as a cheap kind of labour force. We've seen cuts to policing. And an increase in private security. The list of things is endless. But one thing you mentioned in our email are the changes to the benefit system. Now, ideally, I'm not a fan of government handouts. If people want to be free, they need to be self-sufficient and community-orientated instead of Big Brother handing things out, with a catch, that catch being control over you. But they have bred a society that is dependent on benefits, and now they're trying to pull that rug away. Talk us through the implications of this plan to force people to work without pay or lose their unemployment benefits, because it kind of looks like a slave deal. What's your take on that?
Yeah, this is called the Work Programme. This is how it's described by the Department for Work and Pensions. And what it essentially says is that if you signed on the dole for a year, shouldn't really call it a dole, job seekers allowance they call it now, then you'll have to go and do these work placements. It can be a lot less than a year, depending on if they think you really, really need the experience more than someone else. But for a lot of people it'll be a year, for a lot of people it'll be less than a year. And I've looked through all the legislation on this, because I know what government reports are like. They come out and make them sound as fluffy is the only word I can use to describe as possible. And all the devil's in the detail in the actual report themselves. And if you actually read through the legislation, if you actually look at the DWP documents, again, I can't recommend that too highly, because they're not very interesting to read. But there is the stuff that they can do while you're on this work program is outrageous. And the number of people they're planning to put millions of people through this program. And of course, they try and make it sound like a charity thing. And there are a significant number of people that are currently working for charities, but they've already put people in Tesco's and Asda and Primark. And of course, the thing they don't talk, and it went out to corporate tender, as they describe it, ages ago, and lots of corporate tenders were put in. And I'm sure that once Tesco and Asda and Primark report back to their friends elsewhere and say, yeah, we got a load of people off this work program and we don't have to pay them anything. In fact, the government paid us. I'm sure there will be other corporations that will be willing to take it on.
I think my stepbrother actually, I don't quite know the details, but I think he was made to work in a supermarket for, I guess, less than minimum wage or something weird as part of his, job seekers allowance thing. And he was basically out of pocket for doing this. So and then he didn't get a job at the end of it either. So,
well, why would they give you a job?
Well, exactly. It's a slave force.
They know 3 million people are going to go through this system. Those are the government's own figures over the next 3 to 4 years. So, what kind of people are they going to want? Are they going to be receiving? They're going to be receiving low wage, unskilled people. They can't get a job anywhere else. So why would you create low wage, unskilled jobs if you've got a constant source of labour that you can tap into? And it's another classic example of the government just washing its hands of the poorest people in society, not merely washing its hands of them, but also saying to them, just delivering them to corporations on a silver platter. And that's before you go into all the contracting. One of the key companies involved in the contracting is called Serco. I'm glad someone reminded me of this yesterday. Someone mentioned Serco. They're involved in defence. They're involved in private prisons, and now they're involved in benefits. So, it wouldn't be too sort of exaggerated to say that benefit claimants are being treated like prisoners by a private prison corporation, because that is literally what's happening. Serco are one of the companies primarily involved in running it, and they were given a contract by the government to run the biggest private prison in Britain. Actually, Britain is the country with the greatest percentage of prisoners in private prisons in the world, more so than the United States. This is something I found time and time again when I was researching the book, was if you look at any nefarious trend in the world, you'll find that the United States is number 1 and Britain is number 2 in any list. It could be obesity. In the list, I was talking about a list of creditors, and the United States being 196th on that list, Britain are 193rd on that list. In terms of private prisons, Britain's got the most in the world, the United States has got the second most. Cocaine usage, Britain's got the most in the world, the United States is right up there. Time and time again, these are just the ones that came to me off the top of my head, but there were many others. And I think it's because of this. There's been this traditional, historic Anglo-American relationship. You constantly hear every political leader of Britain and America has stood up and say, "Oh, it's a special relationship. It's a special relationship that we have, and we need to maintain it." It's good for the corporate sector. It's good for the banking sector. It's good for the industrial sector. It's not so good for the people.
No.
So that's really what the work program is about. It's just really. It's another way. It's another way of corporatizing the poor. It's much like you mentioned people working early in the program. You mentioned people working in prisons, prison labour. That's something that's already exploited heavily in the United States and in Britain to a lesser extent. But the Tories are looking to extend this now, and I'm sure they'll get what they want, even though they've been told by the Union of Prison Workers that their plans are unworkable, but they'll pay absolutely no attention to that whatsoever, I'm sure. So I don't know what will happen with that exactly, but I think if you look at, I always pick the example of Afghanistan as being a really good example of showing how the system works. If you look at the history of Afghanistan, because it started going back with Operation Cyclone. Yeah. This was between 1979 and 1989. This was the open US plan to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This is not a secret. They weren't even secretive about it at the time. They perhaps didn't shout it from the hills at first, but over time they openly said, yeah, we're doing this, and they called them Mujahideen freedom fighters.
Well, wasn't it Reagan? What did he? Some rocket or something? He launched a rocket in the name of the Mujahideen or something. One of the space things, but
Reagan extended the policy. Yeah, he was this person that first got up on a public stage and called them freedom fighters. It was actually signed by Carter in 1979, which is interesting because he likes to boast about the fact that America never fired a bullet while he was the president, but he doesn't really mention the fact they did fund the Taliban while he was the president, and he signed the documents off. The documents are in the book.
Brzezinski as well actually came out in a French magazine and said that they actually began funding the Mujahideen before the Red Army invaded. So it was almost a covert way of getting the Red Army to invade by... similar to Pearl Harbor. They always say, oh, because the Russians invaded. Well, no, you kind of enticed them to invade. So...
I mean, I didn't know that actually, but they clearly intended to get them embroiled in a very long conflict that would ultimately crush the Soviet Union, which is exactly what happened, of course. Then after Operation Cyclone, there was like the 10-year period where the US very carefully monitored what was going on in Afghanistan. There was essentially bloody civil war. The Taliban tried to take control of the country. After there was obviously 9/11, which everyone knows about. The US then invaded to fight the government they'd radicalised and funded. At the time they invaded Afghanistan, opium production had gone down to virtually zero because the Taliban had phased it out due to their deep religious convictions, supposedly. Who knows what the reason for doing it was, but the fact is they'd phased out opium production. As soon as the US get in there, opium production starts going through the roof. It actually reached a peak at the point where the US had virtually taken over the entire country. So if you just think about that in practical terms, the US has got total military penetration over virtually the entire country, but somehow they're managing to grow opium, the Afghanistani farmers. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't sound right. And obviously, they've been caught God knows how many times before they started saying, oh yeah, we're openly supporting this, we're letting them grow the opium, and then, they were caught shipping drugs out of the country God knows how many times.
Karzai's brother was caught, so it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. And there's been cocaine planes all over Latin America as well. Just come down. They turned out to be US military planes. They've got 1,000 tons of cocaine in them and stuff like that in Latin America. So there's no doubt about that whatsoever. And then once they run the drugs into the country, they then bust people in the street for the drugs they've run into the country to feed the private prison system. The private prison contractors profit from the prisoners. They literally trade them on the stock market and get paid per prisoner. Corporations use the prisoners that are in prison as slave labour, pay them like pence to work for 10 hours a day. And the list of corporations that have done this in the United States in particular is massive. There's companies that you would think are completely benign. One that comes to mind is Pierre Cardin. I don't know why that particularly comes to mind, but you wouldn't think Pierre Cardin were using slave labour in prison, but they are. Meanwhile, the sort of war on drugs is used as rhetoric to ramp up the police state. It creates an underclass as well, because you have crack cocaine all over LA. That's basically killed areas of LA, and that now that they are genuinely like war zones, so that gives you even more rhetoric.
That whole thing was very interesting. How they essentially assassinated all the Black Power leaders, got rid of all the kind of powerful male role models, and then whoop-de-doo, they've shipped in all the drugs, and we have like a decades and decades of gang warfare in LA. So, well done, globalists.
Yeah, I mean it's obviously if you look at, I don't know if you've watched the film American Drug War, but if you look at Skid Row in LA, there is no way that place is ever going to recover. I mean, it would take. You'd have to throw millions and millions of dollars at it, because there are tons of people there straight away that need to go into clinics, and they need to be supported for a considerable period of time to even get off the drug. And then the entire economy of the area is totally reliant on drugs. This is the same thing with Afghanistan. I know you've reported on the news report where they're talking about opium in Afghanistan and saying, oh yeah, we're just trying to support the farmers and stuff. Mm. And I heard one general I think it's an army general, some member of the United States military saying, "Oh, we'd like them to grow cucumbers instead of opium, but this is their culture." Never once making the rather obvious facile point that, surprisingly, you make rather a lot more money selling opium than you do selling cucumbers. I mean, if anyone could change the Afghanistan economy from revolving around cucumbers, from revolving around opium to revolving around cucumbers, that person's a genius. But this is what you saw in Latin America. Bolivia was one place. Their economies became completely reliant on coca production, which I read. I assume this is true. I don't know whether it is or not. I'm not an expert in coca production, but apparently it doesn't require much to set up to do. It's very cheap. Start-up for business as well, so that's another advantage. But you're saying, what shall I grow? Cocaine, watermelons, what am I going to, and it just, for poor people, they just had no choice. And this would have been the case anyway, but then you see the World Bank and International Monetary Fund interfering and making sure that they grow cocaine and making sure that they grow opium. And, all of this is then used as rhetoric to ramp up the police state. Meanwhile, Obama's increased the troop numbers in Afghanistan. He got up on a stage during the election and said, "Oh, I'm the big anti-war president. I'm going to phase out all these wars." And he's still talking about phasing out. When you hear him talk about Afghanistan, and he did so a while ago, it's all the rhetoric and the tone of it is all, "Yeah, we're closing down our operation in Afghanistan." But there's more American troops in Afghanistan than when Bush left the White House, and they won't be reduced till, I think it's later in 2012, and Obama's timetable to withdraw the troops is 2014, which coincidentally...
Then it'll probably be private mercenaries afterwards anyway, just continuing it, so...
Yeah, I mean, definitely Blackwater, for example, will have a presence, for sure. But I was just going to say that the 2014 deadline coincidentally coincides with a projected date of a completed gas pipeline related to the Caspian Basin. So if that gets pushed back, look for Obama coming on TV and saying, "Well, we haven't managed to instill democracy yet in Afghanistan, so we're going to have to stay there a year longer." And although, as you just mentioned, although they've ostensibly withdrawn the combat troops from Iraq, Blackwater is still there, and there are still non-combat troops in Iraq. So there's still a US military presence, and that should hardly surprise us because there's a US military presence in 135 nations. So this is what you see, and the whole economy of Britain, and to an even greater extent the United States, is driven by three things, and you can see these three things writ large across every area of policy. It's oil, financial fraud, and war profiteering. And if you take those three things away, or if you even take one of those three things away, there ain't no economy left. And David Cameron can come on TV all day long, and Obama can come on TV all day long and say, "Oh, we're looking to create jobs, we're looking to do this, we're looking to do that." It's all meaningless, because if you just said, in the US, the financial sector is 31% of the GDP. In the UK, it's 15%. Let's say and a lot of that is fraud. If you hear, I really listen to Max Kaiser because he explains it very well. He will explain to you that what most of the activity that takes place is completely fraudulent. It's not even immoral; it's illegal. So let's say you cut that down by 50% in Britain. So let's not use the United States. Let's use Britain, which is the smaller example. That means you'd be cutting the gross domestic product by 7.5%. So you'd have to create tens of billions of dollars of productivity elsewhere. I mean, it's not possible. It can't be done. So obviously there's been a plan, but then it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, because these sort of interests have become so powerful that even if we had ambivalent politicians that wanted to do good things, it's a very far-fetched notion, but I suppose it's possible. It's becoming incredibly difficult, or it has become incredibly difficult.
It's almost too late.
Well, I don't think they can stand up to them in terms of. I mean, if you want to stand up to J.P. Morgan Chase, it becomes impossible because they forge relationships with other banks, and these banks have got trillions of dollars, and there was they can and have, these international banks, crashed entire economies in a day, and they do it all over the world. If you look what happened in Argentina with the IMF, where the IMF just completely bankrupted the country, and there were people in the streets rioting. And if you think you've seen riots in this country, I mean, it doesn't even come close to what happened in Argentina. And this was because they froze everyone's bank account in the entire country, apart from a very small number of privileged people. And, people understandably weren't too happy about this, so they ended up out on the streets. And as I say, it's kind of like Tiananmen Square, but with the public on the rampage instead of the state tanks. But there was plenty of military out there firing tear gas and stuff. But they only recovered once there was a president called Nestor Kirchner in Argentina who kicked the IMF out, who refused to deal with them at all, who came up with a very difficult plan that, there was definite hardship in Argentina. And when we view these countries, we tend to think, backwards Argentina, they don't have a good standard of living. They basically do have a good standard of living. And in the future, it's quite possible these sort of nations, I would argue that it's probable, that the likes of Argentina and Brazil will begin to have a better standing of living in Europe because our economies are finished. So
Libya had a great standard of living and was only improving before NATO bombed the hell out of the place.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, I've heard people talking about Iraq and saying before the West got involved, and I don't mean when the Gulf War happened. I mean when they started backing Saddam openly. Before that, Iraq was a pretty liberal place, particularly by Middle East standards, and people had a pretty good standard of living. We tend, even people that know different, like myself, we tend to think in Iraq it's very backward and it's just a big desert and they're all very superstitious. Of course, not the case at all. I mean, they had a very good academic structure and they still have good academics to this day. And most people would tend to look at a country like Brazil and think, they're all poor, and of course there's poverty. Of course there's poverty, and of course there are rough areas, and of course there are problems. But Brazil actually has a very good economic plan. This is one of the things I wrote about in the book. They're creating biofuels out of sugar, and it's supposed to be very effective, and they've become a lot more self-sufficient, far more self-sufficient than Britain. Britain is one of the least self-sufficient countries in the world. If we didn't have North Sea oil, we'd barely be self-sufficient at all. One of the statistics I particularly like to quote about the UK is that we import 50% of our food and 95% of our fruit, and those are the government's own figures. They think about that objectively. We import 95% of our fruit. So if we stop doing that tomorrow, can you imagine what the price of fruit would be? It would be quite high, needless to say.
So it'd be good if in schools they, just simple things like teach people to grow their own food. If you teach somebody to be self-sufficient from being a child, then they don't have to rely on anybody, but they want us to rely on the beast. So.
Yeah, I'm assuming you went to a comprehensive school. I certainly did, and I think the aim of the comprehensive school system is, I think Huxley's Brave New World, that describes this society in which you know exactly what social class you're going into from the moment you're born, is not a million miles away from the way it works out. I think the comprehensive school system is intended to turn out the people that are going to fill what I described as the C1 to E positions, lower managerial and just worker positions, and to accept that there are people above them that will make the decisions and they don't get a say in it, and to be happy with that. And that's what happens at school, and that's what school is about. You don't learn anything useful. I mean, you don't learn anything about nutrition, for example. You didn't when I was at school. I don't know if they teach kids anything about nutrition now, but no one has ever even suggested to us that I probably ate chips every day if I was at school. I would imagine, and no one suggested any difference. Only my mum that actually taught me anything useful on that subject.
Well, when I left school, it was basically the EU's great, love the EU. We had a kind of a new lesson, something like humanities or some weird newspeak term, and it was just basically, this is the EU's great, it's good for trade. Okay.
That must have been horrifying, really. I mean, we didn't get that because Britain was still pretending it.
Worries me what they're learning today, because I saw some of these things coming in when I was at school. Today it must be horrendous.
Well, I mean, I've been working with people, and they're sort of, I'm at work with them, and they've got the mobile on, and they speak on the phone to someone, they're sounding quite apologetic, and I'm going, what's going on? And they're saying, it's the school are giving me a hard time because my kid's not in school. And I'm saying, why is your kid not in school? He's ill. And the schools behave now like they own the children. They literally behave like they own them. When I was at school, I used to decide whether I went or not, and that was it. And I mean, there was a pretty obviously there was still some sort of authoritarian aspect to it, but it was a bit more. It wasn't so much. There was still a lot of indoctrination, and there was still a lot of indoctrinating people into the idea of being part of an institutionalization, but there was more of a partnership, I feel, between the teacher and the kids than there is today. I mean, when I look at it today, they're virtually like prisons, the schools, and the way they... And I haven't had to deal with the reality of having a child, and I don't know how I would. I hope I could homeschool my child. I don't know, but the way the schools treat the children now, for me, is outrageous. It's like the child's feelings should come secondary to the school's reputation and the school's modus operandi, which has to be wrong, just on a psychological level, let alone an ethical or moral level. So I can't imagine what it'd be like being in school now, but it can't be great.
It can't be great, and neither is internet radio, because we've just been cut off. So I want to thank Chris for coming on the show. Be sure to get a copy of his book at the link in the info box if you check the info box on YouTube. But from me, I'll catch everybody next week. Keep resisting.
If you found the preceding information valuable, please consider buying a DVD or making a small donation of your choosing. Go to wideshut.co.uk/donate. That's wideshut.co.uk/donate. You are the resistance.